We are devoted to the defense of Israel. We will support Israel. We will help defend Israel, and Iran will not succeed. Thank you very much.
As the war in Gaza enters its 11th month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's stated aim of total victory over Hamas seems more distant than ever.
And the Israeli army's chief spokesperson is casting doubt on Israel's goal to destroy Hamas.
With over 40,000 Gazans killed since October last year, many of them women and children, pressure is mounting on the Netanyahu government to find a resolution to the conflict.
The defense of Israel is still critical, so you cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead.
The International Criminal Court has called for leaders of Hamas and Israel to stand trial over alleged war crimes, and the International Court of Justice has declared Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory unlawful under international law.
The court considers that these policies and practices amount to annexation of large parts of the occupied Palestinian territory.
And yet, as global scrutiny and condemnation of Israel's actions has intensified, its most important ally has remained steadfast, continuing to supply billions in weaponry and support. So why does the United States remain so unequivocal in its support for Israel? From the lands of the Kulin Nation, I'm Emma Hoy, and this is Leave It to the Experts. Ever since Israel was carved out under the 1947 United Nations partition plan for Palestine, Washington has grown closer and closer to its key ally in the Middle East. What began as American sympathy and support for a Jewish homeland in the wake of the Holocaust evolved into a partnership built on shared interests and ideals. To help us unpack things further, we've brought in international relations scholar Dr. Martin Kear from the University of Sydney. Dr. Kear, welcome to Leave It to the Experts. As the war in Gaza continues on, we are continuing to see incredibly strong support for Israel from the United States. Could you explain why this is the case? What are some of the main historical or political factors behind that continuing alliance?
Well, I think the US support for Israel has now become so entrenched on both sides in American politics for Democrats and Republicans that it's almost axiomatic and certainly universal, and you would almost say unqualified, given what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank at the moment. Now, there are several reasons for that. Certainly there are historical reasons, political reasons, and also, I think, ideological reasons. There is an affinity, I think, between the United States and Israel in the fact that Israel and the United States are both as much ideals as they are states. Now, certainly that has developed since probably the 1960s, when President Kennedy was the first one to really start to give unqualified support to Israel. Now, that was as much to do with the Cold War. It's the 1960s, so the Cold War is at its height. Israel is seen as a democratic beacon of stability in a region that was unstable, surrounded by a sea of authoritarian states more leaning towards the USSR. So it became that beacon of stability and democracy in the Middle East. But also trying to garner votes, Jewish votes, back in the United States in the early 60s for his own presidency, and I think it was even before that for his own Senate campaign. So there's a lot of crossovers there between domestic politics in the United States and their support for Israel on both sides of the aisle.
So then continuing on into the present day, we've seen this incredible bipartisan support for Israel continuing. And a lot of commentators or even critics have put that down to the very strong lobbying efforts of AIPAC and other Jewish lobbying groups. Could you tell us a little bit more about them and their impact in shaping America's policies towards Israel?
Well, certainly AIPAC is a tremendously important lobbying group in the United States. I think its power and influence gets overemphasized at times. I don't think it's any more or less powerful than other lobbying groups like the NRA like the pharmaceutical industry, like the oil industry, etc. But it does have, I think, an influence on the foreign policy because, again, of this affinity between the ideal of the United States and the ideal of Israel. The number of Jewish Americans on both sides of politics in the United States who are members of Congress, and I think you start getting that. That's perhaps where the lobby groups have an easier access to Congress and the Senate. There's also support for Zionism, and that, again, is this affinity of the Israeli state. It was formed as a state for Jews, where Jews would always be the majority and free from persecution from other people. And that persecution, freedom of persecution, is one of those underlying factors of the United States. When you look back on the formation of the United States, people escaping from Europe, escaping from the prejudices, the inequities. And that egalitarianism, I think, is something that there is an affinity there between Jewish Americans and particularly the Democratic Party.
I think, one interesting distinction that a lot have pointed out between the lobbying efforts of AIPAC, for example, and other lobbying groups is that AIPAC is fundamentally lobbying on behalf of a foreign government and one that receives vast amounts of military and other kinds of aid from the United States. And even though both nations are linked by these shared ideals, as you've said, both have faced a lot of criticism, particularly in recent months and years, over what some perceive to be a gap between those ideals and actions and escalations in conflict, like the kinds we're seeing in Gaza at the moment. So do you think that those shared ideals are fracturing now in the face of a lot of international condemnation?
I think from the very beginning, the Biden administration was in an enviable position. It came out in support of Israel in the immediate aftermath of the October 7 attacks, as did all democratic states. But I think if we cast our memories back, President Biden said from the very beginning, he gave a warning to the Israeli government not to become fixated by revenge in the same way that the United States had become fixated by revenge in Afghanistan and Iraq. And unfortunately, this is exactly what has happened in Israel, that the Israeli government has become fixated on revenge and seeking to achieve their own long-term political goals and ideological goals of crushing all Palestinian resistance. And that is resistance to, in their perception, resistance to the existence of an Israeli state. Behind closed doors, I think that the diplomacy there, I think there's some frank discussions between the United States and the Israeli government. But Netanyahu clearly understands American politics in that in an election year, the President of the United States, a Democratic President of the United States, cannot come out in open opposition to the Israeli government and criticise the Israeli government as it would criticise other governments for similar actions. So there is this disconnect between the Americans' vociferous condemnations of excesses by Putin's regime, both inside its own state and in what's happening in the Ukraine. And it's far more measured and some would say feckless announcements concerning Israel.
As you've said, Benjamin Netanyahu is a very savvy political operator. He's very aware of the domestic political situation in the United States. He's had what some might think is a sort of friendly president in Joe Biden, who is a self-described Zionist. What might a Kamala Harris presidency mean for the relationship, or Trump? Who is Netanyahu more likely to look favorably upon as a potential ally?
Well, I think that a President Trump administration, another Trump administration, would be far more amenable to Netanyahu just saying, we need to destroy Hamas. Now, Netanyahu knows that he cannot destroy Hamas. All of the generals say that he can't destroy Hamas because Hamas exists. Hamas is an expression of Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. So you're not going to destroy Hamas. You can't destroy an ideal. What you can do is destroy any hope that Palestinians may have for achieving a Palestinian state. And I think President Trump would be more amenable to that sort of argument and just say, we just need to crush them. Because the United States could stop the war tomorrow. if they refuse to resupply Israel with ammunition, if they refuse to provide Israel with satellite intelligence and other forms of intelligence, if they refuse to supply Israel with the billions and billions of dollars in aid. But Netanyahu is a very savvy political leader, because he knows that if there is a ceasefire, as soon as that happens, his government is likely to collapse. Or if he signs a ceasefire without the agreement of his far right, he will lose his position. And as soon as he loses his position, then he'll be brought before the court for the corruption charges that have been hanging over him for the past decade. And it's not just him, it's his wife and his sons who will also be brought before the court.
So Benjamin Netanyahu is finding himself in this increasingly vulnerable position and is very reliant on the United States' continuing support. There has been speculation over Kamala Harris's outlook on Israel. As you might know, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was recently passed over for vice president, and some believe it's because of his strong backing of Israel and his Jewish background. How do you think a Kamala Harris presidency would shape their policies towards Israel?
I don't think it'd change it at all. Perhaps there would be a slightly different tone that would be different to a Trump presidency. I think you would see the unwavering support and increased support for Israel because it doesn't lose your votes. Starting to see a more nuanced narrative from the Harris campaign is because the Democrats are trying to appeal to Arab Americans and say, look, we're taking a different line, we can take a tougher line. But at the end of the day, no measurable difference whatsoever. Perhaps behind the scenes, there would be a more strident diplomatic tone, but I think publicly and policy-wise, it wouldn't change a thing.
Is the military superiority of the US-Israel alliance the only deterrent to a wider regional conflict? You know, why does the Muslim world remain relatively passive in the fight against Israel, despite public opinion and sort of fiery rhetoric from their leaders?
I think that, in the background, I think the United States is spending a lot of money and it's calling in a lot of chips. The fact that the Jordanian king is silent, given the fact that there are so many Palestinians who live in Jordan, the fact that the Jordanian king is Palestinian, the fact that he is being quiet is, I think, emblematic of the fact that the United States is placing an enormous amount of diplomatic pressure on Jordan, on similar states to stay quiet, not to criticise, not to be overtly anti-Israel. Even when Israel is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, you have the allegations from the International Criminal Court, the warrants that have been issued for Netanyahu and the Defence Minister. The fact that the Arab world is quiet is a fact, I think, of intense US and European Union diplomacy to stop this from escalating. And it's also, don't make us have to come out and look bad by supporting Israel wholeheartedly. It's the United States and Europe buying off the Arab world.
Can you foresee a future in which Israel and the United States are no longer strong allies?
No. The short answer would be no. There's too much at stake politically within the United States. The Republicans, from the Republican side, they see Israel as this bastion of democracy, this bastion against socialism, against Islamism. The more evangelical side, a strong Israel is a precursor for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the stronger you make Israel, the more you crush Palestinian resistance to an Israeli state, the stronger the state of Israel, the sooner Jesus Christ comes again. Now, not every evangelical believes that to the same extent, but there is a sizable portion of the evangelical vote that sees a strong Israel as a precursor for the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Dr. Martin Kear, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
The civilian death toll in Gaza continues to rise as the IDF relentlessly hunts Hamas across the Strip and beyond.
Dozens of people reportedly killed, including children, after Israel launched a new round of airstrikes on a school complex in Gaza. The IDF saying the location was also being used as a Hamas headquarters and hideout.
Israel's assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran last month is tipped to elicit some form of Iranian retaliation and perhaps drag the entire region into a wider war.
Clearly a much more aggressive attempt to escalate, an attempt to bring in actors beyond even this region, perhaps even including the US.
And still, US support pours in, with Congress this week approving another $20 billion worth of weapons sales to Israel, sending more fighter jets, military vehicles, missiles, shells, and explosives to a nation embroiled in a war that only 42% of Americans approve of. The implications of this unwavering alliance continue to ripple across the Middle East and beyond. Meanwhile, the conflict in Gaza grinds on, with no end in sight. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. For more of what we do, head to 360info.org. There you can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner and Reese Hooker. Music by Jan Skubashevsky at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.